Welcome back!
Bible contradictions? Question mark?
Alright, so this week we have yet another critic claiming contradictions in the Bible. Pastor Trenton, what do you think about this?
Hey, thanks, Jim. Alright, so we have perceived problems, but we also have simple solutions. So the problem isn't what the Bible actually says, but with what the critic adds to what is written, or assumes for what is not written. So let's examine carefully what is written. Now the scriptures are on the screen for you to examine. In 26:14, it is written that the men fell to the ground. Well, in 9:7, it is written that they stood. Now the critic can only make it a contradiction by assuming that they never fell and then stood after falling. But logically, if they fell, they most likely stood back up, especially if they had not been blinded, yet Saul had been blinded. And why would they have stood speechless? Well, because they had been overcome by a bright light and heard the voice, just as it is written in 22:9. It is written in 9:7 that they saw no person, not that they didn't see the light. So the critic would have to assume they didn't see the light even though they saw no person from whom the voice originated. It is written in 22:9 that the men did not understand the voice, not that they didn't hear it. The critic would have to assume that the men didn't hear what they didn't understand. It is written in 26:13-14 that the men fell to the ground because of the light they saw. And though it is not written in this specific verse that they heard the voice, the critic would have to assume they never heard the voice, even though it's written elsewhere that they did hear the voice, even though they didn't understand it. So an argument from silence is not a good argument. Listen, as a good detective, we must examine the entire testimony as one. Now, if I were one of the men, I would have been speechless too. After all, Saul, who is Paul, got blinded by the light, whereas the others did not. Yet, they could not deny what happened. The Lord merely chose to blind Saul and not the others. Scripture never states a contradiction of what was seen or heard. They saw light, but no person. They heard the voice, but did not understand what they heard. At one time they fell down, and at one time they stood speechless. Now we must remember, many credible eyewitness testimonies do not always describe events in chronological order while listing every detail. In fact, many credible eyewitnesses will describe many different details when retelling the events. And sometimes the details are undesigned coincidences that fill in the blanks from earlier statements where certain details were left out or not mentioned. Now to me, this only reveals credible eyewitness testimony rather than a lie someone conjured up in order to coerce an audience of an event that didn't actually happen. And because it was all written by the same author, it seems even less likely that it would be a false contradictory testimony. And if it were truly contradictory, don't you think the author would have rewritten his story so as to make every detail coincide without question? In addition, we must remember that the author of Acts is the very author who scholars have determined to be a scrupulously accurate historian, even in the smallest details. That, as it turns out, I wrote an article on that. And not only has the book of Acts been deemed historically accurate and reliable, but the author of Acts is the author of Luke, which coincides and affirms what is written in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and John. In fact, all of Scripture is intertwined together like one big tapestry, which reveals God's nature, our purpose in life, and God's plan for our salvation. So, in conclusion, these specific verses under examination, like many other scriptures found within the Bible, they are apparent contradictions, but not actual contradictions. Back to you, Jim.
Well, there you have it. Another apparent contradiction, but no actual contradictions. Well, see you next time.
Bible contradictions? Question mark?